In the peaceful farmlands of Pennsylvania, where the Amish have worked the same soil for generations, Samuel Miller thought he knew every inch of his family's land. The morning started like any other, with his plow cutting through the rich earth behind his team of draft horses. Then the blade struck something that shouldn't have been there. What he unearthed changed everything he believed about his quiet corner of the world. A massive iron cross, blackened with age and partially buried for decades, emerged from the soil. But it wasn't alone. A thick, rusted chain extended from its base, disappearing deep into the earth and stretching across his property. Samuel had never seen anything like it. His grandfather had never mentioned it. The church elders knew nothing of its existence. What could require such a heavy chain to keep it buried? What secret had his peaceful community been built upon? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the peaceful farmlands of Pennsylvania, where the Amish have worked the same soil for generations, Samuel Miller thought he knew every inch of his family's land. The morning started like any other, with his plow cutting through the rich earth behind his team of draft horses. Then, the blade struck something that shouldn't have been there. What he unearthed changed everything he believed about his quiet corner of the world. A massive iron cross, blackened with age and partially buried for decades, emerged from the soil. But it wasn't alone. A thick, rusted chain extended from its base, disappearing deep into the earth and stretching across his property. Samuel had never seen anything like it. His grandfather had never mentioned it. The church elders knew nothing of its existence. What could require such a heavy chain to keep it buried? What secret had his peaceful community been built upon? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Samuel wiped the sweat from his brow and crouched beside the iron cross, his calloused hands tracing its surface with reverent curiosity. The metal felt ancient beneath his fingers, its surface pitted with age and weathered by decades underground. This wasn't the simple ironwork he knew from local blacksmiths. The craftsmanship spoke of another time, another place entirely. Each link of the chain attached to the cross's base measured nearly 3 inches across, forged with a precision that seemed impossible for something buried so deep. The metal rang with a dull, hollow sound when Samuel tapped it with his plow handle, as if it were made from iron mixed with something else he couldn't identify. Strange markings covered several links, symbols that looked like letters but belonged to no alphabet he recognized. His draft horses, normally calm and steady, stamped nervously at the field's edge. Their usual willingness to approach Samuel anywhere on the property had vanished the moment the cross emerged from the earth. Even Belle, his most trusted mare, refused to come within 20 feet of the excavation site, her ears flat against her head and her eyes rolling white with fear. The chain itself disappeared into the ground at an angle, clearly following a deliberate path rather than lying randomly buried. Samuel could trace its approximate route by subtle depressions in the earth, a line that stretched from his current location toward the old-growth forest that marked his property's eastern boundary. His grandfather had always said that forest was never to be cleared, though he'd never explained why. When Rebecca arrived with his midday meal, her reaction was immediate and visceral. His wife of 25 years took one look at the cross and stepped backward, her hand instinctively reaching for the small Bible she always carried in her apron pocket. "Samuel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what have you found?" He explained how the plow had struck the cross, how the chain extended deep into the earth, how the horses refused to approach. Rebecca listened in silence, her blue eyes growing more troubled with each detail. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "some things are buried for good reason." But Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that this discovery wasn't accidental. The morning's plowing had followed the same pattern he'd used for 15 years, yet today the blade had struck something that seemed to be waiting for him. The cross hadn't been buried carelessly or randomly. Someone had placed it there with purpose, with planning, with the clear intention that it would eventually be found. That evening, as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and purple, Samuel made his decision. The chain called to him with a pull he couldn't explain, a certainty that following its path would answer questions he didn't even know he had. "Tomorrow," he told Rebecca, "I'm going to follow where it leads." She nodded slowly, though her hands trembled, as she folded her mend. "Then I suppose," she said, "we'll learn what secrets our quiet land has been keeping." The next morning arrived with a crisp autumn chill that made Samuel's breath visible as he gathered his tools. He'd chosen his implements carefully: a narrow spade for precision work, a small pickaxe for harder ground, and a long iron rod for probing ahead of his excavation. Rebecca had packed extra water and sandwiches, though neither of them spoke about why this might take longer than usual. Samuel began his work methodically, following the chain's underground path by tracing the subtle depression in the earth. Every few feet he would carefully excavate just enough to confirm the chain's presence and direction before filling the hole back in. His grandfather had taught him to respect the land, to disturb it as little as possible while still accomplishing necessary work. 20 yards from the original cross, his spade struck something hard that wasn't chain. Samuel worked carefully around the obstruction, brushing soil away with his hands until a gleaming brass object emerged from the dark earth. It was a surveyor's compass, its brass case tarnished green with age, but still intact. The glass face had somehow survived decades underground without a crack. The compass was unlike any he'd seen in modern times. Intricate engravings covered its brass surface, and the needle housing bore inscriptions in what appeared to be Latin. Most mysteriously, when Samuel held it level, the needle didn't point toward magnetic north. Instead, it swung consistently toward the northeast, following the exact direction the chain was leading. Samuel tested the compass repeatedly, moving it to different positions, but the result remained the same. The needle ignored magnetic north entirely, as if it had been designed to follow something else altogether. When he placed it directly over the buried chain, the needle's movement became more agitated, spinning in small circles before settling on its northeastern heading. Rebecca joined him for the midday meal, bringing fresh bread and butter that normally would have been a welcome break. But Samuel found himself too excited to eat properly, showing her the compass and demonstrating its strange behavior. "It's as if," he explained, "someone surveyed this entire route before burying the chain. This compass isn't pointing to magnetic north, it's pointing along a planned path." Rebecca examined the compass with growing unease. The Latin inscriptions meant nothing to her, but something about the device's purposeful design disturbed her deeply. "Samuel," she said quietly, "whoever buried this chain, they wanted someone to follow it. They left tools to help guide the way." That realization sent a chill through both of them that had nothing to do with the autumn air. This wasn't a random burial or an accident of history. Someone had carefully planned for a future discovery, had provided the tools necessary to follow their trail, had wanted their secret to eventually be found by the right person at the right time. Samuel continued his excavation throughout the afternoon, the compass guiding him along the chain's path with increasing accuracy. The route followed natural contours of the land, avoiding areas that would have been swampy or unstable. Whoever had planned this path understood the property's geography intimately, perhaps better than Samuel understood it himself. As the sun began to set, Samuel realized the chain was leading him directly toward the old-growth forest his grandfather had always protected. The same forest that had never been cleared, never been logged, never been explained. The compass needle grew more agitated as they approached the tree line, its movements suggesting they were nearing whatever destination the chain was meant to reach. Standing at the forest's edge, Samuel felt the weight of generations pressing down on him. His grandfather had walked this same boundary countless times, had gazed into these same woods, with knowledge Samuel was only beginning to acquire. The compass in his hands felt warm, almost alive, as if it were eager to complete the journey it had been waiting decades to finish. Tomorrow, Samuel told Rebecca, as they gathered their tools, we go into the forest. She nodded, though he could see the fear in her eyes. They were no longer simply following curiosity or solving a mystery. They were completing a task someone had set in motion long before either of them was born, following a path that had been planned with their eventual discovery in mind. The brass compass seemed to pulse with anticipation in Samuel's pocket as they walked home, its needle pointing steadily towards secrets that had been waiting patiently in the darkness of the old-growth forest. Word of Samuel's discovery had spread through the community like ripples in a pond, carried by the careful whispers that connected Amish households across the valley. By Sunday morning, curious glances followed him during worship, and hushed conversations paused when he approached. The Iron Cross had become the subject of speculation that reached every kitchen table and every barn raising. Elder Jacob Yoder arrived at Samuel's farm on Monday morning, his black buggy cutting a familiar silhouette against the autumn landscape. Jacob had served the community for 40 years, his wisdom sought on matters both spiritual and practical. His weathered face bore the lines of someone who had witnessed the full cycle of life many times over, and his presence commanded respect from families who had known him for generations. "Samuel," Jacob said, climbing down from his buggy with the careful movements of a man past 70, "I think it's time we had a conversation about what you've uncovered." They walked together to the excavation site, where the Iron Cross remained partially exposed, its chain disappearing into the earth like a question waiting for an answer. Jacob examined the artifact with intense interest, his fingers tracing the strange markings Samuel had discovered on the chain links. "These symbols," Jacob murmured, more to himself than to Samuel, "I haven't seen their like in many years." From his coat pocket, Jacob withdrew a small leather case, worn smooth by decades of handling. Inside, wrapped in faded silk, lay a daguerreotype photograph mounted in a simple wooden frame. The image showed a group of perhaps 20 people gathered around what appeared to be the foundation of a building, their faces serious and formal in the manner of mid-19th century photography. Samuel studied the photograph carefully. Most of the faces were familiar, bearing the distinctive features of families he'd known all his life. But scattered among the recognizable faces were several people he'd never seen before. Men and women whose clothing and bearing suggested they came from outside the Amish community. "This was taken in 1853, Jacob explained, "during the construction of our first meeting house. My great-grandfather kept this photograph, though I never understood why until recently." Jacob pointed to one of the unfamiliar faces, a tall man standing slightly apart from the main group. This man arrived just before the photograph was taken. He stayed for 3 months, helping with construction, then disappeared as suddenly as he'd come. According to my great-grandfather's diary, he claimed to be a surveyor, but his work had nothing to do with building foundations. Samuel felt a chill of recognition. The brass compass in his pocket seemed to grow heavier as Jacob continued his explanation. "There were others like him," Jacob said, indicating 2 more unfamiliar faces in the photograph. "They came separately, at different times, but always claimed to be helping with community development, always stayed exactly long enough to complete some unnamed task, then vanished without explanation." The implication was clear but unstated. These strangers had been working on something beyond the visible community development, something that required secrecy and careful timing. The photograph represented evidence of a hidden history that ran parallel to the community's official founding story. "What did they want?" Samuel asked, though he suspected the answer involved the chain currently leading from his property toward the old-growth forest. Jacob folded the photograph carefully back into its silk wrapping. "That's what I hoped you might help us discover. Your grandfather was very young when these strangers were here, but he remembered them. Before he died, he told me that someday someone would find what they left behind." The revelation that Samuel's grandfather had known about the buried chain changed everything about the discovery. This wasn't an accident or a surprise. It was the fulfillment of a prediction made decades earlier by someone who had witnessed the stranger's mysterious work. "The community elders have decided," Jacob continued, that you should continue following the chain, but you won't be doing it alone. We need to understand what these people buried on our land, and why they thought it was important enough to hide for so many years." That evening, as Samuel shared Jacob's revelations with Rebekah, they both realized their quiet discovery had become something much larger. They were no longer simply following their own curiosity. They were fulfilling a role that had been planned for them before they were born, completing work that strangers had begun over 70 years earlier. The daguerreotype's unfamiliar faces seemed to watch them from across the decades, patient and expectant, waiting for the final chapter of whatever story they had begun in the quiet Pennsylvania farmland so long ago. The chain led Samuel and Jacob through increasingly dense undergrowth as they approached the old-growth forest that had stood untouched since before the community's founding. Ancient oaks and maples towered overhead, their canopies so thick that even midday felt like twilight beneath their branches. The surveyor's compass grew more agitated with each step, its needle spinning in tight circles before settling on the northeastern heading that had guided them this far. At the forest's precise boundary, Samuel's spade struck stone with a sharp ring that echoed through the tree. They worked together to clear away decades of fallen leaves and accumulated soil, revealing a limestone boundary marker that stood nearly 3 feet tall. The stone had been expertly carved and deliberately placed, marking not just property lines but something far more significant. The symbols carved into the limestone made Samuel's breath catch in his throat. A compass and square were etched deep into the stone's surface, their precise lines still sharp despite decades of weather. Below these familiar Masonic symbols, a series of Christian crosses had been carved with equal care, their varying styles suggesting different denominations or traditions. At the base of the marker, Hebrew letters formed words neither Samuel nor Jacob could translate. Jacob ran his fingers over the carved symbols with obvious recognition. "My great-grandfather's diary mentioned markers like this," he said quietly. He called them covenant stones, though he never explained what covenant they represented. The chain continued past the boundary stone into the forest proper, following what appeared to be an ancient pathway that predated the surrounding community. Trees on either side of the path grew in unnatural patterns, their trunks slightly bent as if something had once passed regularly between them. The forest floor along the path showed subtle signs of long-ago human activity, stones arranged in small cairns, trees with branches pruned to allow passage, clearings that seemed too regular to be natural. As they ventured deeper into the woods, Samuel noticed that local wildlife avoided the path entirely. No squirrels chattered in the trees overhead, no birds sang in the branches, no deer tracks crossed their road. The forest felt alive but watchful, as if they were being observed by unseen eyes that evaluated their worthiness to continue. The surveyor's compass began behaving even more strangely as they followed the path deeper into the forest. Its needle would suddenly swing toward specific trees or rock formations, pause for several seconds, then return to its northeastern heading. Jacob suggested that other markers might be hidden throughout the forest, creating a network of reference points for whoever had originally surveyed this route. After walking for nearly an hour, they encountered another boundary stone, this one smaller, but bearing even more elaborate carvings. In addition to the Masonic and Christian symbols, this marker included what appeared to be Arabic script and symbols that looked vaguely Egyptian. The diversity of religious and cultural references suggested cooperation between groups that rarely worked together in the outside world. Whoever planned this, Samuel observed, brought together knowledge from many different traditions. These aren't the markings of a single religious group or secret society. Jacob nodded thoughtfully. "My great-grandfather wrote about the gathering of the faithful from many paths. I always thought he was speaking metaphorically about religious tolerance." The chain continued past the second boundary stone, leading them toward what appeared to be a natural clearing ahead. But as they approached, Samuel realized the clearing wasn't entirely natural. Trees had been selectively removed to create an open space, and the remaining trees formed an almost perfect circle around the perimeter. At the clearing's center, the chain disappeared into a hillside that looked too regular to be a natural formation. The hillside bore subtle signs of human modification. Stones had been carefully arranged to create what appeared to be a concealed entrance, camouflaged so effectively that it would be invisible to anyone not following the chain directly to it. Moss and vegetation had been encouraged to grow over the stonework, creating the illusion that this was simply another forest hill. Standing at the threshold of whatever lay beneath the hillside, Samuel felt the weight of generations pressing down on him. The boundary stones, the carefully planned path, the concealed entrance, all of it spoke of a level of organization and secrecy that extended far beyond anything he'd imagined when his plow first struck the iron cross. The surveyor's compass in his hand pointed directly at the hidden entrance, its needle steady for the first time since they'd entered the forest. They had reached their destination, whatever it might contain. The concealed entrance proved to be more sophisticated than either Samuel or Jacob had anticipated. What appeared to be natural stone formation was actually a carefully engineered doorway, its heavy stones balanced on hidden pivots that allowed the entire section to swing inward with surprising ease. The engineering spoke of people who understood both construction and the need for absolute secrecy. Inside, the passage was lined with fitted stones that showed no mortar joints, each block cut to interlock perfectly with its neighbors. The craftsmanship reminded Samuel of pictures he'd seen of ancient Roman construction, built to last centuries without maintenance. Oil-soaked torches in metal brackets lined the walls, though they hadn't been lit in many years. The chain continued along the passage floor, leading them deeper into the hillside through carefully carved tunnels that showed no tool marks on their smooth walls. Whoever had created this underground space possessed skills that went far beyond typical 19th century construction technique. 20 yards into the passage, Samuel's outstretched hand encountered something unexpected, hanging from a low branch that had somehow grown through a gap in the stone ceiling. His fingers closed around a metal object that felt familiar yet foreign, a chalice made of tarnished silver, suspended from the branch by a leather cord that had somehow survived decades in the underground environment. Jacob held their oil lamp closer while Samuel examined the chalice carefully. The silver was dark with age, but showed no signs of corrosion, suggesting it had been crafted from exceptionally pure metal. Intricate engravings covered its surface, depicting scenes that seemed to blend Christian imagery with symbols from other religious traditions. Around the rim, Latin words were inscribed in elegant script that spoke of sacred vessels and divine protection. Most intriguingly, the chalice base bore the same compass and square symbol they'd seen on the boundary stones, but surrounded by additional symbols that included what appeared to be Hebrew letters, Arabic script, and geometric patterns that suggested Islamic influence. The vessel represented a fusion of religious traditions that would have been impossible to create openly in most 19th century communities. This wasn't hidden here by accident, Jacob observed, examining the leather cord that had secured the chalice to the branch. Someone placed it exactly where followers of the chain would find it, at exactly the right height for discovery. Samuel noticed that the chalice's interior showed signs of recent use. While the exterior was tarnished with age, the inside gleamed with the patina that came from regular cleaning and careful maintenance. Someone had been visiting this underground space regularly, using the chalice for purposes that could only be guessed at. The chain continued deeper into the hillside, but the chalice's discovery changed their understanding of what they were exploring. This wasn't simply a hiding place or storage area. The chalice suggested ritual use, ongoing ceremony, active maintenance by people who understood the space's original purpose. As they continued following the chain, Samuel began noticing other signs of regular human activity. The torch brackets showed evidence of recent use, with oil stains on the stone beneath them that hadn't had time to fade completely. Footprints in the dust suggested multiple people had walked this path within the past few months, their boot prints creating a worn trail that paralleled the buried chain. The passage began to widen, opening into what appeared to be a natural cavern that had been modified for human use. The chain led to the cavern's center, where it connected to an iron ring embedded in a raised stone platform. The platform itself was covered with symbols that matched those on the chalice, a mixture of Christian, Jewish, Islamic and Masonic imagery that suggested cooperation between groups that were often at odds in the outside world. Jacob's lamp revealed additional details that made both men catch their breath. The cavern walls were lined with stone alcoves, each one designed to hold specific objects. Most of the alcoves were empty, but several still contained items wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected them from moisture and decay. The chalice in Samuel's hands seemed to pulse with significance as they realized they had discovered not just a hiding place, but an active sanctuary that had been maintained by dedicated guardians for decades. The chain hadn't led them to buried treasure or forgotten history. It had led them to a living tradition that continued to operate in absolute secrecy within their own community. Standing in the lamplight, surrounded by evidence of ongoing ritual activity, Samuel understood that they had become part of something much larger and older than they had ever imagined. The chalice represented not just discovery, but initiation into mysteries that had been carefully preserved for generations. The raised stone platform at the cavern's center drew them forward like a magnet, its surface covered with symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the flickering lamplight. The chain's terminus at the iron ring suggested this was the destination. Everything had been leading toward the heart of whatever mystery had been buried beneath Samuel's peaceful farmland. Behind the platform, mounted on the cavern's back wall like an altarpiece, stood a stone tablet that took Samuel's breath away. Nearly 4 feet tall and 2 feet wide, the tablet had been carved from a single piece of dark granite and polished to a mirror finish. Every inch of its surface bore inscriptions in multiple languages, the text arranged in precise columns that spoke of careful planning and scholarly expertise. Jacob moved closer with the lamp, revealing that the Latin text formed the tablet's central column, surrounded by translations or parallel passages in Hebrew, Arabic, and what appeared to be ancient Greek. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each letter cut with the precision of someone who understood that this message was meant to last for centuries. Samuel began reading the Latin aloud, his years of biblical study allowing him to translate the ancient words. Here lies the sacred covenant of the faithful guardians, established in the year of our Lord, 1852, witnessed by representatives of the people of the book from many traditions, sealed with the blessing of those who serve the one God through different paths. The tablet continued with details that made both men's hearts race. It described a covenant between the children of Abraham from 3 traditions and the brotherhood of the square and compass to protect sacred relics and divine artifacts from the persecution that drives the faithful from their homes and threatens the preservation of holy things. As Samuel continued translating, a picture emerged of an extraordinary alliance. Christian refugees fleeing religious persecution in Europe had joined forces with Jewish families escaping pogroms, Muslim scholars preserving ancient texts, and Masonic lodges committed to protecting religious freedom. Together, they had created a network of hidden sanctuaries throughout the American frontier, each one designed to preserve irreplaceable artifacts and documents from destruction. The tablet revealed that the Amish community had been specifically chosen as guardians because of their commitment to pacifism, their isolation from mainstream society, and their proven ability to maintain traditions across generations without outside interference. The strangers in Jacob's daguerreotype hadn't been random visitors. They had been representatives of the covenant, establishing this sanctuary and training selected community members as its guardian. Most remarkably, the tablet indicated that similar sanctuaries existed throughout Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana, all connected by underground passages and protected by guardian networks that operated in complete secrecy. The chain Samuel had followed was part of a security system that would guide authorized visitors while preventing accidental discovery by outsiders. Jacob's hands trembled as he read the Hebrew portions of the inscription, his knowledge of biblical Hebrew allowing him to understand references to preserving the sacred writings and protecting the vessels of the temple that suggested artifacts of extraordinary historical and religious significance were hidden within these sanctuary networks. The tablet's final section, carved in slightly different stone that suggested it had been added later, bore a warning that chilled both men. Let none approach these sacred trusts without pure intention and willingness to accept the burden of eternal guardianship. Those who seek knowledge from curiosity alone will find only confusion. Those who seek treasure will find only responsibility. Those who seek to serve the divine through preservation of his gifts will find purpose beyond their understanding. Standing before the tablet, Samuel realized that his simple discovery of an iron cross had led him to the heart of a religious preservation network that spanned multiple states and involved hundreds of people across several generations. The sacred covenant represented cooperation between groups that were often enemies in the outside world, united only by their shared commitment to protecting irreplaceable artifacts from destruction. The tablet made clear that this sanctuary was only one small part of a much larger operation. The chain he had followed was connected to underground passages that stretched for miles in every direction, linking storage areas, meeting places, and escape routes that had been planned with military precision. As Jacob translated more of the Hebrew text, they learned that the Covenant Guardians had rescued artifacts from European churches destroyed during religious wars, synagogues burned during pogroms, and Islamic libraries scattered by persecution. These treasures weren't just hidden, they were actively studied, preserved, and prepared for eventual return to communities that could protect them properly. The Sacred Covenant tablet revealed that Samuel's peaceful Amish community sat at the center of one of the most ambitious religious preservation efforts in American history. Jacob's lamp revealed a stone alcove carved into the cavern wall beside the Sacred Covenant tablet, its interior lined with oiled leather that had protected its contents from decades of moisture. Inside, wrapped in silk that still retained traces of deep blue dye, lay a manuscript that made both men's breath catch when Jacob carefully lifted it into the lamplight. The illuminated manuscript was a masterwork of medieval craftsmanship, its vellum pages covered with text written in multiple hands and languages. Gold leaf still gleamed from elaborately decorated initial letters, and margins filled with intricate drawings showed that this had been created by master scribes who spared no expense or effort. The binding, though worn, bore silver clasps that had somehow avoided tarnishing despite the underground environment. Samuel recognized the main text immediately. It was a Latin version of the Gospel of John, copied with the careful precision that marked monastery scriptoriums of the medieval period. But as Jacob turned the pages carefully, they discovered that this was no ordinary religious manuscript. The margins contained annotations in dozens of different hands, written in languages that ranged from Latin and Greek to Hebrew, Arabic, and scripts neither man could identify. The marginal notes weren't simple commentary or translation aids. They formed a complex system of cross-references, coded symbols, and hidden messages that transformed the religious text into something approaching a guidebook for the Covenant Guardians. Specific verses had been marked with symbols that matched those found on the boundary stones and chalice, creating a symbolic language that could be understood by initiates regardless of their native tongue. One page contained a hand-drawn map that showed the underground tunnel system they had been exploring, complete with distances, compass bearings, and notations about hidden entrances throughout the region. Other pages included genealogical charts that tracked guardian families across multiple generations, showing how responsibility for protecting the sanctuary network had been passed down through bloodlines that crossed traditional religious boundaries. Most remarkably, the manuscript contained detailed inventories of artifacts hidden throughout the sanctuary system. Listed in careful columns were medieval reliquaries, illuminated manuscripts predating the printing press, Torah scrolls rescued from burned synagogues, and Islamic texts that had survived the destruction of libraries in Spain and North Africa. The scope of preservation efforts described in these pages staggered both Samuel and Jacob. The annotations revealed that the manuscript itself served as both guidebook and record for covenant operation. New entries appeared to have been added as recently as the 1890s, indicating that the Guardian network remained active well into the era that both men remembered from their childhood. References to Brother Heinrich's successful retrieval mission and Sister Maria's establishment of the Western Sanctuary suggested ongoing operations that had continued long after the original covenant was established. Jacob pointed to a genealogical chart that made Samuel's heart race. Listed among the Guardian families were names he recognized immediately: Miller, Yoder, Stoltzfus, and Byler, surnames that belonged to prominent families in their own community. According to the manuscript, Samuel's great-grandfather had been an active guardian, responsible for maintaining the eastern section of the tunnel network and training younger men in preservation techniques. The manuscript explained why certain community members had been selected as guardians, while others remained unaware of the covenant's existence. Guardian families were chosen for their demonstrated commitment to religious principles, their ability to maintain secrets across generations, and their willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for the protection of sacred artifacts. Each guardian took an oath of secrecy that bound not only themselves but their descendants to the covenant's mission. One section of the manuscript, written in a more recent hand, addressed the challenges facing guardians in the modern era. Railroad development, government land surveys, and increasing settlement density all posed threats to sanctuary security that earlier guardians hadn't faced. The notes described contingency plans for relocating artifacts, alternative routes for accessing hidden chambers, and communication systems that could coordinate guardian activities across multiple states without arousing suspicion. The final pages of the manuscript contained what appeared to be initiation instructions for new guardians, complete with ritual procedures, oath requirements, and training protocols that would prepare them for their responsibilities. These pages made clear that Samuel's discovery of the Iron Cross wasn't accidental. It was the beginning of an initiation process that had been planned by guardians who understood that knowledge would eventually need to be passed to the next generation. As Jacob closed the manuscript carefully, both men realized they had discovered not just historical artifacts, but active instructions for continuing a mission that had protected irreplaceable religious treasures for nearly half a century. The revelation that his family name appeared in the manuscript's genealogical records sent Samuel into a state of shock that rendered him temporarily speechless. Jacob, meanwhile, seemed less surprised than Samuel might have expected, his weathered face showing an expression that suggested recognition rather than amazement. "Samuel," Jacob said quietly, reaching into his vest pocket with the deliberate movements of someone who had been preparing for this moment for years, "I think it's time you understood why your grandfather asked me to watch over you." From his pocket, Jacob withdrew a small object wrapped in black cloth. As he unwrapped it carefully, the lamplight revealed an ornate signet ring made from what appeared to be silver and gold worked together in intricate pattern. The ring's face bore the same compass and square symbol they had seen throughout their underground journey, but surrounded by Hebrew letters and Christian crosses that matched the designs on the sacred covenant tablet. Samuel stared at the ring as Jacob placed it in his palm. The metal felt warm despite the cool underground air, and the craftsmanship was extraordinary, the kind of work that required not only skill but access to precious metals and tools that weren't available to ordinary craftsmen. "This ring belonged to your great-grandfather," Jacob explained, "and to his father before him, and to his father's father before that. It marks the bearer as a guardian of the sacred covenant, authorized to access all sanctuary areas and trained in the preservation of religious artifacts." Samuel turned the ring over in his hands, discovering that the inner band was engraved with text in multiple languages. He could make out Latin words that translated to faithful guardian and Hebrew letters that Jacob translated as keeper of sacred trust. Around the band's circumference, tiny symbols created a code that matched the marginal annotations in the illuminated manuscript. Jacob's explanation continued with details that transformed Samuel's understanding of his own family history. His great-grandfather hadn't simply been a successful farmer and respected community member. He had been a key figure in the Covenant network, responsible for training new guardians and coordinating preservation activities across multiple states. The ring had been passed down through generations with the understanding that each bearer would eventually train his successor and pass on both the physical symbol and the knowledge necessary to fulfill guardian responsibilities. Samuel's grandfather had died before completing this training, leaving Jacob to serve as interim guardian until Samuel was ready to accept his inheritance. "But why wasn't I told about this earlier?" Samuel asked, struggling to process the magnitude of what he was learning about his own family's secret history. Jacob smiled sadly. "Your grandfather wanted to wait until you had children of your own, until you had demonstrated the maturity and judgment necessary for guardian responsibilities. He died before that time came, but he made me promise to watch for signs that you were ready to learn the truth." The discovery of the Iron Cross, Jacob explained, hadn't been accidental. Guardian families planted signs that would eventually lead their descendants to discover the Covenant network when they were spiritually and emotionally prepared to accept the responsibilities that came with that knowledge. Samuel's patient excavation of the chain, his respectful treatment of the artifacts, and his willingness to seek guidance from community elders had all demonstrated his readiness for initiation. Rebecca's connection to the Guardian network, revealed through her family name's appearance in the manuscript's genealogical records, explained why she had been drawn to Samuel despite their different family backgrounds. Guardian families had intermarried for generations, creating bloodlines that were naturally suited to preservation work and capable of maintaining secrets across multiple generations. The ring itself served multiple practical purposes beyond its symbolic significance. Its unique design allowed guardians to identify each other without verbal communication, and the coded engravings provided access to information that was distributed among authorized guardians, but never written down in complete form. The ring was both key and credential, opening physical locks and providing authentication for guardian activities. As Samuel slipped the ring onto his finger, he felt the weight of generations settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just jewelry or even a family heirloom. It was a tool that connected him to a network of people who had devoted their lives to preserving religious artifacts from destruction and loss. Jacob's expression grew more serious as he explained the ring's final significance. Wearing it meant accepting not just the honor of guardian status, but the lifetime commitment that came with protecting irreplaceable treasures that belonged to multiple religious traditions. The ring bound its wearer to secrecy, sacrifice, and service that would extend until death and beyond, passed on to carefully chosen successors who would continue the mission for future generations. With the ancestral ring on his finger, Samuel felt a profound shift in his understanding of the world around him. Jacob, sensing this transformation, led him deeper into the cavern system through a passage that had been invisible until approached from the correct angle. The tunnel curved downward, following natural rock formations that had been carefully modified to create a hidden thoroughfare. The passage opened into a larger chamber where Jacob's lamp revealed something that made Samuel gasp in amazement. Mounted on the wall was an underground map, unlike anything he had ever seen, drawn on what appeared to be specially treated leather that had survived decades in perfect condition. The map showed an intricate network of tunnels, chambers, and passageways that stretched far beyond Samuel's property, connecting dozens of locations across 3 counties. Each location on the map was marked with different symbols that corresponded to the codes Samuel had seen in the illuminated manuscript. Some sites were marked with crosses, indicating Christian artifact storage. Others bore Hebrew letters, showing locations where Jewish religious items were preserved. Islamic crescents marked chambers containing rescued manuscripts and ceremonial objects from Muslim communities, while Masonic squares and compasses indicated meeting places and coordination centers. Samuel traced the tunnel routes with his finger, amazed by the scope of engineering and planning represented in the underground network. The main arteries followed natural underground watercourses and limestone formations, while smaller connecting passages linked individual properties and storage areas. His own farm sat at a crucial junction where four major tunnels converged, making it a natural command center for the entire regional network. Jacob pointed to various locations on the map, explaining their significance with the authority of someone who had visited most of them personally. "This chamber here," he said, indicating a symbol near the town of Lancaster, contains Torah scrolls that were rescued from a synagogue fire in Philadelphia 20 years ago. The Jewish community believed they were destroyed, but our guardians managed to save them and have been preserving them ever since. Another location, marked with Islamic crescents, housed manuscripts that had been smuggled out of Spain during the final expulsion of Muslim scholars in the Christian sites contained artifacts ranging from medieval reliquaries to illuminated prayer books that had survived the destruction of European monasteries during various religious wars and political upheavals. The map revealed that the Guardian Network operated like a sophisticated intelligence organization, with different cells handling specific types of preservation work while maintaining security through compartmentalized knowledge. Samuel's family's location made them natural coordinators, but most individual guardians knew only about their immediate area and the specific artifacts under their protection. Red lines on the map indicated emergency evacuation routes that could be used if any part of the network was discovered or compromised. These alternate passages led to temporary storage sites and eventually to connections with Guardian networks in other states, creating a system that could preserve artifacts even if local operations were shut down. Jacob explained that the network included not just storage facilities, but active conservation workshops where skilled craftsmen worked to repair and preserve damaged artifacts. The map showed locations where bookbinders, metalworkers, and textile experts quietly restored treasures using techniques that had been passed down through generations of guild craftsmen who had joined the Covenant. Most remarkably, the map indicated that the network was still growing. New locations, marked in different ink that suggested recent additions, showed that Guardian activities had continued well into the fresh tunnel construction. Additional storage chambers and expanded connection routes demonstrated that the Covenant remained active and adaptive to changing circumstances. Samuel noticed that several locations on the map were marked with special symbols that Jacob translated as active sites requiring immediate attention. These locations apparently contained artifacts that were at risk due to changing conditions or security concerns, requiring Guardian intervention to prevent loss or discovery by outsiders. The map also showed planned expansions that would extend the network into Ohio and Indiana, connecting with other religious communities that had expressed interest in joining the preservation effort. The scope of coordination required for such expansion indicated that the Covenant leadership included people with resources and connections far beyond typical rural religious communities. Standing before the underground map, Samuel realized he had discovered not just a local preservation effort, but a sophisticated operation that rivaled anything created by government agencies or major religious institutions. The Guardian Network represented decades of planning, enormous financial investment, and coordination between groups that rarely cooperated on such scales in the outside world. Jacob led Samuel through another passage that branched off from the map chamber, this one descending more steeply into the earth. The walls here showed different construction techniques, with fitted stones giving way to natural limestone that had been carved and polished smooth. The air grew cooler as they descended, and Samuel could hear the distant sound of underground water flowing somewhere in the darkness ahead. At the bottom of the passage, they entered a chamber that felt more like an archive than a storage room. Stone shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, each one carefully designed to protect its contents from moisture and temperature fluctuation. Jacob's lamp revealed that many shelves held wooden boxes and metal containers, while others displayed artifacts that had been specially mounted for long-term preservation. In the center of the chamber, protected by a glass case that showed remarkable craftsmanship for the 19th century, lay a collection of documents that made Samuel's breath catch. The papers appeared to be original manuscripts, official seals, and legal documents that bore the signatures of prominent historical figures. Jacob carefully opened the case, revealing that these weren't just historical curiosities, they were persecution records that documented the systematic destruction of religious communities across Europe. The documents painted a horrifying picture of organized religious persecution that had driven thousands of people from their homes and destroyed centuries of accumulated religious art and scholarship. Samuel read accounts of synagogues burned with their congregations locked inside, monasteries dissolved and their libraries scattered to the winds, and Islamic communities expelled from regions where they had lived for generations. One particularly detailed report, written in French but translated in marginal notes, described the destruction of a monastery library in Alsace that had contained irreplaceable manuscripts dating back to the 8th century. The document listed specific books and artifacts that had been destroyed, but Samuel noticed that several items on the list were marked with small symbols that matched the codes used throughout the Guardian network. Jacob explained that these persecution documents served multiple purposes for the Covenant Guardians. They provided evidence of the ongoing threats that made preservation work necessary, documented which artifacts had been officially destroyed and could therefore be hidden without their disappearance being noticed, and maintained records of religious communities that might someday reclaim their scattered treasures. The documents revealed that the Guardian network had been far more proactive than Samuel had imagined. Rather than simply preserving artifacts that came to them by chance, Covenant members had actively worked to rescue treasures from communities under threat. They had maintained networks of informants throughout Europe who provided advance warning when persecution was planned, allowing rescue operations to remove valuable items before destruction occurred. Samuel found himself reading detailed accounts of rescue missions that read like military operations. Guardians had disguised themselves as merchants, government officials, and even members of persecuting religious groups to gain access to threatened communities. They had bribed officials, forged documents, and created elaborate deceptions to spirit artifacts away from destruction. One document described a particularly audacious operation in which Covenant members had staged a fake fire at a Jewish cemetery, using the confusion to remove Torah scrolls and religious vessels that were later transported to America and hidden in sanctuary networks like the one Samuel had discovered. The community believed their treasures had been destroyed in the fire, protecting them from further persecution while ensuring the artifacts' preservation. The persecution records also revealed the personal costs paid by Guardian network members. Several documents were letters from families describing the imprisonment or death of Covenant members who had been caught during rescue operations. These martyrs had died protecting religious treasures that belonged to communities other than their own, sacrificing their lives for the principle that sacred artifacts transcended sectarian boundaries. Jacob pointed to more recent documents that showed persecution hadn't ended with European religious wars. American communities had faced their own threats from nativist movements, government suspicion of foreign religions, and economic pressures that forced religious groups to sell their treasures to survive. The Guardian network had continued its preservation work by purchasing artifacts from struggling communities and hiding them until they could be safely returned. The most sobering documents dealt with the network's failures, detailed accounts of artifacts that had been lost despite Guardian efforts, communities that had been destroyed before rescue operations could be mounted, and treasures that had disappeared into private collections or been destroyed by ignorant officials who didn't understand their significance. Standing surrounded by evidence of systematic religious persecution, Samuel finally understood the true magnitude of what the Covenant Guardians had undertaken. They weren't just preserving pretty objects or satisfying historical curiosity, they were protecting the irreplaceable heritage of multiple religious traditions from forces that sought to eliminate diversity and impose uniformity through violence and destruction. The weight of the persecution documents pressed heavily on Samuel's mind as Jacob led him to the chamber's deepest alcove. They are protected by layers of oiled cloth and secured in a specially constructed metal box, lay an ornate key unlike any Samuel had ever seen. The key measured nearly 8 inches long, its shaft decorated with intricate engravings that seemed to tell a story in symbols and images. Jacob lifted the key with reverence that bordered on worship. "This," he said quietly, "is the Guardian's key. It opens the deepest chamber in our network, the place where we keep the artifacts too precious to risk storing anywhere else." The key's head was shaped like a miniature version of the sacred covenant tablet, bearing the same mix of Christian, Jewish, Islamic and Masonic symbols that had marked every significant artifact in their underground journey. But these symbols weren't simply decorative, they were functional elements that corresponded to multiple lock mechanisms designed to prevent unauthorized access. Samuel examined the key more closely, discovering that it consisted of several interlocking pieces that could be assembled in different configurations. Jacob demonstrated how rotating certain sections of the key revealed different sets of teeth, each one designed to operate a specific lock. The engineering was far more sophisticated than anything Samuel had seen from 19th-century locksmiths. "The deepest chamber requires 3 separate keys to open," Jacob explained. "This Guardian's key plus 2 others that are held by Covenant members in different states. No single person can access the most sacred artifacts alone. It requires cooperation and consensus among multiple Guardians." The key's shaft contained a hollow section that Jacob showed him how to open. Inside, a tightly rolled document provided detailed instructions for the key's use, written in the coded language that Samuel was beginning to recognize from other Covenant materials. The instructions included not just mechanical details about operating the locks, but spiritual preparations that Guardians were expected to complete before entering the deepest chamber. Samuel read that accessing the sacred chamber required fasting for 24 hours, ritual purification according to traditions from all 3 Abrahamic faiths, and the recitation of specific prayers that acknowledged the Guardian's responsibility to preserve artifacts belonging to religious communities other than their own. The spiritual requirements were as complex as the mechanical ones, reflecting the Covenant's understanding that protecting sacred objects required more than just physical security. Jacob revealed that the deepest chamber could only be opened during specific times of the year, when all 3 required Guardians could coordinate their schedules and complete the necessary preparation. These occasions had become formal ceremonies that reinforced the bonds between Covenant members and renewed their commitment to the preservation mission. The Guardian's key represented more than just access to stored artifacts. It symbolized the trust placed in individuals who had proven their dedication to interfaith cooperation and their willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for the protection of religious heritage. Carrying the key meant accepting responsibility for treasures that belonged to communities scattered across multiple continents and centuries. Samuel learned that only 12 Guardian's keys existed in the entire network, each one entrusted to individuals who had demonstrated exceptional commitment to Covenant principles over many years. The keys were never inherited automatically, but were awarded through a selection process that involved evaluation by existing Guardians and approval from religious leaders representing all traditions within the Covenant. The key's most remarkable feature was its ability to record access attempts. Hidden mechanisms within its structure kept track of when and how it was used, creating an automatic log that prevented unauthorized access and ensured accountability among Guardians. This level of sophisticated engineering suggested that the Covenant had access to craftsmen and inventors whose skills far exceeded those commonly available in rural American communities. Jacob explained that the Guardian's key also served as a communication device. When assembled in specific configurations, it could leave coded messages for other Guardians, coordinated activities between distant network locations, and provide verification that instructions came from authorized Covenant members. The key functioned as both tool and credential, enabling complex operations while maintaining security. As Samuel held the guardian's key, he felt the full weight of covenant responsibility settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about preserving old books and ceremonial objects. It was about maintaining a sacred trust that connected him to religious communities across the world and throughout history. The key represented his initiation into mysteries that demanded not just secrecy, but active participation in ongoing preservation work. The decision to accept or decline guardian responsibilities could no longer be postponed. Jacob's patient guidance had brought Samuel to the moment when he must choose whether to dedicate his life to protecting treasures that belonged to all humanity, or to step back from discoveries that would forever change his understanding of faith and duty. Samuel's decision came not through careful deliberation, but through a moment of absolute certainty that seemed to arise from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. As he held the guardian's key, feeling its weight and complexity, he understood that his entire life had been preparation for this moment. He looked at Jacob with steady eyes and nodded once. Jacob's smile carried the relief of someone who had carried a burden alone for too many years. From his coat, he produced 2 additional keys that matched the guardian's key in craftsmanship and complexity. "Brother Heinrich from Ohio arrived yesterday," Jacob explained. "Sister Catherine from Lancaster has been waiting in the upper chamber for the past hour. They knew this day would come." The 3 guardians met in the chamber containing the underground map, where Samuel was introduced to his fellow covenant members with the formality that such meetings required. Brother Heinrich, a Mennonite farmer, whose weathered hands spoke of decades working the soil, carried himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to protecting valuable secrets. Sister Catherine, an elderly woman whose plain dress marked her as belonging to a conservative Christian community, possessed eyes that sparkled with intelligence and deep spiritual conviction. Together, the 3 guardians descended through passages Samuel hadn't known existed, following routes that required all 3 keys to unlock sequential barriers. The security system was extraordinary in its complexity, with each lock requiring not just the correct key, but specific timing and coordination between all 3 guardians. The deepest chamber, when they finally reached it, took Samuel's breath away completely. The space was larger than any of the previous rooms, its ceiling disappearing into darkness above their heads. But it was the contents that rendered him speechless. Display cases lined the walls, each one containing artifacts that belonged in the greatest museums of the world. The relic collection represented centuries of religious art and craftsmanship from every major faith tradition. Medieval illuminated Bibles bound in covers, decorated with precious stones, shared space with Torah scrolls, written on parchment that had survived since the early Middle Ages. Islamic manuscripts, their pages adorned with geometric patterns that seemed to dance in the lamplight, rested beside Christian reliquaries that contained fragments claimed to be from the true cross. Samuel moved from case to case like a man in a dream, hardly able to process the magnitude of what he was seeing. Here was a chalice that Brother Heinrich claimed had been used in the court of Charlemagne. There stood a menorah that Sister Catherine said had been rescued from the sack of a German synagogue during the Crusades. In the center of the chamber, a display case held what appeared to be fragments of ancient scrolls that bore text in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek scripts that predated most surviving biblical manuscripts. The preservation techniques used throughout the chamber represented the most advanced conservation methods available, with climate control systems, humidity regulation, and protection from light that rivaled a data found in major European libraries. The Covenant Guardians had spared no expense or effort in protecting these irreplaceable treasures from deterioration and decay. Brother Heinrich explained that many of the artifacts had been acquired through rescue operations that spanned multiple generations of guardian families. Some items had been purchased from communities facing economic hardship, while others had been secretly removed from locations where they faced imminent destruction. Each artifact came with detailed documentation that tracked its history, provenance, and the circumstances of its preservation. Sister Catherine showed Samuel manuscripts that contained texts which had been lost to mainstream scholarship, including versions of religious writings that differed significantly from commonly accepted versions. These variants provided insights into the development of religious thought that could revolutionize understanding of early Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, if they were ever made available to scholars. The most remarkable section of the collection contained artifacts that appeared to be much older than Samuel had expected to find. Stone tablets bearing inscriptions in ancient scripts, metal vessels whose designs suggested origins in the earliest periods of organized religion, and fragments of textiles that seemed to date from biblical times itself. Samuel realized that he was looking at treasures that religious communities throughout the world believed had been lost forever. The Guardian Network hadn't just been preserving artifacts. They had been maintaining a parallel archive of human religious heritage that existed completely outside official institutional control. Standing surrounded by irreplaceable treasures from every major faith tradition, Samuel understood that accepting guardian responsibilities meant becoming a custodian of human spiritual heritage that transcended any single religious community or historical period. The sacred atmosphere of the deepest chamber was shattered when Brother Heinrich produced a leather portfolio that contained documents bearing official seals and modern government letterheads. The papers looked jarringly contemporary compared to the medieval artifacts surrounding them, and Samuel could see immediately that they represented a threat to everything the Guardians had worked to preserve. "These arrived through our network last month," Heinrich explained grimly. "Survey documents from the Pennsylvania Railroad Company planning to extend their main line directly through this area. They're also backed by developers who want to build entire townships along the railroad route." Samuel examined the survey documents with growing alarm. The proposed railroad line would pass within a quarter-mile of his property, bringing with it not just trains, but the infrastructure development that inevitably followed major transportation projects. The plans showed proposed stations, freight yards, and commercial districts that would transform the quiet agricultural region into a bustling center of industrial activity. More disturbing were the land development plans that accompanied the railroad surveys. Private companies had already begun purchasing options on farmland throughout the area, planning residential developments that would house the workers and families drawn by railroad employment opportunities. The scale of planned development would bring thousands of new residents to a region that had remained largely unchanged since the original Amish settlement. Sister Catherine pointed to specific details in the development plans that posed direct threats to Guardian Network security. Modern surveying techniques would inevitably discover the tunnel entrances that had remained hidden for decades. Construction of railroad embankments and building foundations would require excavation that could expose underground passages and storage chambers. The documents revealed that some development companies were specifically targeting Amish and Mennonite properties, believing that conservative religious communities would be easier to pressure into selling at below-market prices. Sales representatives had already approached several Guardian families, offering immediate cash payments for land that would be worth much more once railroad construction began. Samuel realized that the timing of his discovery wasn't coincidental. The Guardian Network had been preparing for this threat, using established communication systems to coordinate responses and evaluate options for protecting the artifacts under their care. His initiation into Guardian responsibilities came at the moment when those risks would be most challenging and most crucial. Brother Heinrich showed Samuel correspondence from other Guardian networks in Ohio and Indiana, reporting similar pressures from railroad development and industrial expansion. The entire Covenant system faced challenges that its founders had never anticipated, threats that modern technology and rapid economic development posed to preservation networks designed for a simpler, more stable era. The survey documents included detailed maps that showed how thoroughly modern developers had studied the region. Property ownership records, soil quality assessments, water source evaluations, and transportation route analyses demonstrated a level of planning and resource investment that far exceeded the Guardian network's ability to oppose through simple refusal to sell. Most alarming were government documents that suggested eminent domain procedures might be used to acquire properties needed for railroad right-of-way, regardless of owners' willingness to sell. The documents revealed that several Guardian families had already sold their properties and relocated rather than risk discovery of the artifact networks they had protected for generations. These departures had disrupted carefully planned succession arrangements and forced remaining Guardians to take on additional responsibilities for which they weren't fully prepared. Samuel studied maps that showed how railroad and development pressure was systematically dismantling the geographic network that had made Covenant operations possible. Properties that had been connected by underground passages were being sold to developers who would unknowingly destroy tunnels and chambers during construction activities. The survey documents represented more than just modern development pressure. They represented the end of an era when religious communities could operate preservation networks in complete secrecy. The industrial age had brought with it technologies and economic forces that made traditional Guardian methods increasingly difficult to maintain. Holding these threatening documents in the chamber, surrounded by irreplaceable religious treasures, Samuel understood that accepting Guardian responsibilities meant not just preserving artifacts, but finding new ways to protect them in a rapidly changing world that posed challenges the Covenant's founders had never imagined. The magnitude of the threat facing the Guardian network required a decision that Samuel had hoped to postpone, but the survey documents made delay impossible. Sister Catherine produced from her satchel a thick, legal document bound in blue ribbon that looked like nothing so much as a formal contract, though its contents were far more consequential than any business agreement. The modern Guardian contract, as Sister Catherine explained, represented the Covenant's adaptation to changing times. Unlike the ancient oaths and traditional ceremonies that had bound previous generations of Guardians, this document was designed to provide legal protection for preservation activities while maintaining the secrecy that remained essential for artifact security. Samuel read through the contract's carefully worded clauses with growing amazement at their complexity and foresight. The document established him as a trustee for a charitable foundation dedicated to religious preservation, providing legal cover for activities that might otherwise be questioned by government authorities or suspicious neighbors. The foundation existed on paper in multiple states, with assets and activities distributed in ways that made comprehensive investigation nearly impossible. The contract included provisions that Samuel had never imagined would be necessary for Guardian work. Legal protections for transportation of artifacts across state lines, insurance policies that covered preservation activities without revealing their specific nature, and financial mechanisms that allowed Guardians to purchase threatened properties through intermediaries who concealed the Covenant's involvement. Brother Heinrich explained that the modern contract system had been developed by Covenant members who were attorneys, businessmen, and government officials capable of navigating legal complexities that would have baffled earlier generations of Guardians. The network now included people with professional expertise in areas that complemented traditional preservation skills. The contract established Samuel's formal authority to make decisions about artifact preservation, relocation, and protection measures within his assigned geographic area. But it also bound him to coordinate those decisions with other Guardians and to accept oversight from Covenant leadership that extended far beyond the local community he had always known. Financial provisions in the contract were particularly sophisticated, establishing trust funds that would support Samuel's preservation activities while providing for his family's needs if Guardian responsibilities required him to relocate or change his lifestyle. The Covenant had evolved from a network of volunteers making personal sacrifices to an organization capable of supporting its members professionally. Most remarkably, the contract included contingency provisions for scenarios that demonstrated the Covenant's awareness of threats, Samuel was only beginning to understand. Emergency relocation procedures, communication protocols for periods when normal contact was impossible, and instructions for transferring guardian responsibilities if Samuel became unable to continue his duties. The document also formalized relationships with institutions that could provide assistance during crisis periods. Universities, museums, and libraries in multiple countries had agreed to provide temporary sanctuary for artifacts if Covenant networks were compromised. These partnerships had been carefully negotiated to ensure that religious treasures would be protected even if their guardian families were scattered or destroyed. Samuel discovered that signing the contract would connect him not just to the local network he had been exploring, but to Covenant operations that spanned multiple continents. Guardians in Europe continued protecting artifacts in their original locations, while American networks had been expanded to include communities in Canada and Mexico. The contract's most sobering clauses dealt with the personal costs that guardian responsibilities might require. Samuel would be expected to relocate if his current location became untenable, to accept changes in his family's lifestyle if secrecy demanded them, and to prioritize artifact preservation over personal comfort or preference. Rebecca's signature was required alongside Samuel's, acknowledging that guardian responsibilities affected entire families, not just designated guardians. The contract recognized that wives and children often bore significant burdens to maintain the secrecy and flexibility that preservation work required. Sister Catherine emphasized that signing the contract was irreversible in practical terms, though the document included provisions for extraordinary circumstances that might require release from guardian obligations. Once Samuel accepted formal responsibility for the Covenant's most precious treasures, his life would be permanently intertwined with their preservation. The modern guardian contract represented both opportunity and obligation. Samuel would gain access to resources, knowledge, and support networks that individual guardians had never possessed, but he would also accept responsibilities that extended far beyond protecting artifacts in underground chambers beneath his own property. As Samuel held the contract, weighing its implications for his family's future, he realized that the choice before him was not simply about continuing traditions established by previous generations. He was being asked to help transform those traditions for survival in a world that posed challenges the Covenant's founders had never anticipated. Samuel's signature on the modern guardian contract felt like stepping across a threshold from which there could be no return. The moment the ink dried on the legal document, Sister Catherine produced from a hidden compartment in her traveling case an ornate medallion that gleamed with the warm luster of ancient gold, its surface covered with symbols that had become as familiar to Samuel as his own reflection. The Guardian's medallion was unlike any piece of jewelry Samuel had ever seen. Nearly 3 inches in diameter, it bore the combined symbols of all religious traditions represented in the Covenant, but arranged in patterns that suggested unity rather than separation. At its center, a compass rose pointed not to magnetic directions, but to spiritual truths that transcended individual faiths. Brother Heinrich explained that the medallion's creation required cooperation between craftsmen from different religious communities, each contributing techniques and materials that reflected their tradition's artistic heritage. Jewish goldsmiths had provided the precious metal, Islamic artisans had contributed geometric patterns that formed the medallion's border, Christian metalworkers had crafted the central imagery, and Masonic craftsmen had added the symbolic elements that unified the diverse components. The initiation ceremony that followed was both solemn and surprisingly intimate. In the deepest chamber, surrounded by the artifacts that Samuel would now help protect, the 3 guardians performed rituals that blended traditions from multiple faiths without compromising the integrity of any single tradition. Samuel recited oaths in Latin, Hebrew, and Arabic, pledging to protect religious treasures regardless of their origin, and to serve the cause of preservation with dedication that would extend throughout his lifetime. Sister Catherine placed the medallion around Samuel's neck with words that connected him to guardians across multiple generations and continents. "This medallion has been worn by 37 guardians before you," she explained. "Each one accepted the same responsibilities you accept today. Each one passed these treasures safely to their successors. Now that chain of protection includes you. The medallion felt warm against Samuel's chest, its weight serving as a constant reminder of the promises he had made and the trust that had been placed in him. Brother Heinrich showed him how the medallion could be opened to reveal compartments containing coded instructions, emergency contacts, and resources that would be available if crisis situations required immediate action. The ceremony continued with practical instruction that demonstrated how thoroughly the covenant had prepared for Samuel's initiation. He received detailed protocols for artifact inspection and maintenance, schedules for coordination with other guardians, and training in preservation techniques that had been refined across generations of experience. Samuel learned that his property would serve as more than just a storage location. It would become a training center where younger guardians could learn preservation skills and a coordination point for network activities throughout the region. The iron cross that had started his journey would remain as a marker for authorized visitors who needed to access the sanctuary system. The medallion contained mechanisms that allowed communication with other guardians through coded signals that could be transmitted across long distances without arousing suspicion. Samuel would learn to coordinate activities with covenant members he had never met, maintaining security while ensuring that preservation work continued efficiently. His training included instruction in recognizing threats to artifact security, evaluating political and economic developments that might affect Guardian operations, and adapting preservation methods to meet changing circumstances. The Covenant expected its Guardians to be more than just caretakers. They needed to be strategic thinkers capable of anticipating challenges and developing solutions. The medallion served as both credential and responsibility. Wearing it identified Samuel to other Covenant members as someone authorized to make important decisions about artifact preservation. But it also marked him as accountable for those decisions and bound by obligations that would influence every aspect of his life going forward. As the initiation ceremony concluded, Samuel understood that he had joined an organization that operated with the dedication of a religious order, the sophistication of a modern corporation, and the secrecy of an intelligence service. The Guardian's medallion represented his formal acceptance into this extraordinary fellowship. Walking back through the underground passages toward the surface world, Samuel felt the medallion's weight against his chest as both burden and privilege. He had accepted responsibility for preserving humanity's religious heritage, regardless of the personal costs that mission might require. The quiet Pennsylvania farmland that greeted them when they emerged from the tunnels looked exactly the same as always, but Samuel knew that his relationship to it had changed forever. He was no longer simply a farmer working inherited land. He was a guardian protecting sacred trusts that connected him to believers across the world and throughout history. 6 months had passed since Samuel's initiation, and the autumn harvest season brought with it a rhythm of guardian responsibilities that had become as natural as planting and reaping. The guardian's medallion no longer felt foreign against his chest, and the weight of protecting sacred artifacts had settled into his daily routine like any other essential farm work that required consistent attention and care. Rebecca had adapted to their new circumstances with the resilience that had carried her through 25 years of marriage to a man who often surprised her. She had learned to recognize the coded signals that indicated guardian visitors, to prepare meals for unexpected guests who arrived at unusual hours, and to maintain the careful balance between normal community life and the secret responsibilities that now shaped their household. On this particular morning, Samuel sat at his kitchen table with a leather-bound journal that Sister Catherine had given him during his initiation. The Guardian's journal was both record-keeping tool and training manual, its blank pages intended to document Samuel's activities, while its margins contained printed guidance for situations that new Guardians commonly encountered. Samuel's entries over the past months told the story of his transformation from curious farmer to dedicated Guardian. Early pages recorded his amazement at discovering the extent of the artifact network, his struggles to master preservation techniques, and his growing appreciation for the complexity of maintaining religious treasures from multiple traditions. More recent entries showed increasing confidence and competence. Samuel had successfully coordinated the relocation of several artifacts that were threatened by railroad construction, had trained 2 younger community members in basic preservation techniques, and had established communication protocols with guardian networks in Ohio and Indiana. The journal contained detailed descriptions of the artifacts under Samuel's care, including condition reports, maintenance schedules, and historical documentation that preserved knowledge about each item's origin and significance. Samuel had discovered that guardian work required as much scholarship as physical preservation, demanding deep knowledge of religious traditions, historical contexts, and conservation techniques. One section of the journal documented Samuel's efforts to adapt traditional preservation methods to modern threats. He had experimented with new techniques for protecting artifacts from railroad vibrations, had developed improved humidity control systems for underground storage areas, and had created contingency plans for rapid artifact evacuation if development pressure required emergency relocation. The journal also recorded Samuel's correspondence with scholars and religious leaders who could provide expert guidance on preservation challenges. The Covenant maintained relationships with academics at universities throughout America and Europe, drawing on their expertise while maintaining strict secrecy about the artifacts, locations, and the Guardian network's existence. Samuel's entries revealed the personal costs that Guardian responsibilities sometimes required. He had been forced to decline community leadership positions that would have demanded time and attention needed for preservation work. He had modified his farming practices to accommodate the underground storage areas that required specific temperature and humidity conditions. He had learned to live with secrets that created distance between himself and neighbors who had been lifelong friends. But the journal also documented rewards that Samuel had never anticipated. His work with artifacts from multiple religious traditions had deepened his own faith, while broadening his understanding of other spiritual paths. His correspondence with guardians in distant locations had connected him to a community of dedicated people who shared his commitment to preserving humanity's religious heritage. The journal's most recent entries dealt with the challenge of training the next generation of guardians. Samuel had begun preparing his eldest son for eventual guardian responsibilities, introducing him gradually to the preservation work while evaluating his maturity and commitment. The process required careful balance between maintaining security and ensuring that guardian knowledge would be passed successfully to the next generation. Samuel had also begun identifying other young people in the community who might possess the characteristics that successful guardians required: spiritual depth, intellectual curiosity, absolute discretion, and willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for larger purposes. The Covenant's future depended on recruiting and training guardians who could adapt preservation work to challenges that were only beginning to emerge. The Guardian's journal served as both personal record and instructional manual for future guardians who would someday inherit Samuel's responsibilities. His detailed entries would provide guidance for successors who would face their own challenges in protecting artifacts that represented humanity's most precious spiritual achievements. Writing in the journal each evening had become Samuel's way of processing the extraordinary transformation that had overtaken his life, helping him maintain perspective on responsibilities that sometimes felt overwhelming in their scope and importance. The spring morning arrived with the kind of gentle warmth that made Samuel grateful for the land that had been entrusted to his care, both the visible acres that produced crops for his family and the hidden chambers that protected treasures for all humanity. He stood in the same spot where his plow had first struck the iron cross, now understanding that the discovery had been inevitable, planned by guardians who knew that knowledge must pass from generation to generation if the preservation mission was to continue. In his hands, Samuel held a wooden toolbox that had been crafted by Covenant artisans, specifically for training new guardians. The Future Guardian's toolkit contained everything necessary to introduce the next generation to preservation work. specialized tools for handling ancient artifacts, magnifying equipment for detailed examination, preservation materials for emergency conservation, and instruction manuals that explained complex procedures in simple terms. Samuel's son, David, now 17 and demonstrating the maturity and judgment that guardian work required, approached from the barn where he had been completing his morning chores. The transition from normal farm work to guardian responsibilities needed to feel natural rather than dramatic, part of a continuous process of learning and growth rather than a sudden initiation into mysterious secrets. "Father," David said, settling beside Samuel on the wooden bench that now marked the Iron Cross's location, "you said today we would begin learning about the old ways." Samuel opened the toolkit, revealing implements that looked like farming tools but had been modified for more delicate work. He had learned to introduce guardian responsibilities gradually, beginning with practical skills that seemed related to normal agricultural activities, before revealing the full scope of what needed to be preserved and protected. The toolkit contained detailed maps of the underground network that David would eventually help maintain, but also included plans for expanding and modifying the system to meet challenges that Samuel's generation was only beginning to understand. Railroad development continued to threaten traditional hiding places, requiring guardians to develop new methods for protecting artifacts while maintaining absolute secrecy. Samuel showed David how to use the specialized tools for cleaning and examining old objects without causing damage, explaining that these skills would be valuable for maintaining family heirlooms and community artifacts, even if David ultimately chose not to accept full guardian responsibilities. The Covenant had learned that gradual introduction worked better than dramatic revelation for most young people. The toolkit's instruction manual had been written by experienced guardians to address questions and concerns that commonly arose during training periods. Samuel read passages that explained how guardian work enhanced, rather than compromised, religious faith, how preservation activities served communities beyond the immediate family, and how the skills learned through artifact care could benefit every aspect of a young person's life. As David examined the tools and began reading the instruction manual, Samuel felt the satisfaction of continuity that had motivated guardians for generations. The knowledge that had been passed to him through Jacob's patient guidance was now beginning its transfer to the next generation, ensuring that the preservation mission would continue regardless of the challenges that lay ahead. The future Guardian's toolkit represented more than just training materials. It embodied the Covenant's commitment to adapting preservation methods for changing times while maintaining the core values that had motivated Guardians since the network's founding. David's generation would face threats that Samuel could barely imagine, but they would face them with tools and knowledge refined by generations of dedicated guardians. Samuel explained that accepting guardian responsibilities was always voluntary, but that the training process itself provided valuable education regardless of David's ultimate decision. The skills involved in preserving ancient artifacts, patience, attention to detail, respect for traditions, willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for larger purposes were qualities that would serve any young person well in whatever path they chose to follow. The toolkit's final component was a letter written by Samuel for David to read when his training was complete, explaining the full scope of guardian responsibilities and the personal costs they sometimes require. Samuel had learned that such decisions needed to be made with complete understanding of their implications, not through emotional pressure or family obligation. As father and son worked together with the guardian tools, Samuel realized that the Iron Cross had led him not just to buried treasures, but to a deeper understanding of how knowledge, faith, and responsibility passed from one generation to the next. The chain he had followed through underground chambers had connected him to a tradition that would continue long after his own service ended. The peaceful Pennsylvania farmlands stretched around them exactly as it always had, but Samuel knew that beneath its familiar surface lay chambers filled with humanity's most precious religious heritage, protected by guardians who understood that some trusts transcend individual lives and connect the faithful across centuries of dedication to preserving what matters most.